Hey besties, it's editing me just to say here is my final project. Any gaps are because there are names that I did not get approved to be shown on the internet. So of course I don't want to like put their information out there if they don't want it. And also my information, like my last name, got cut out. So yeah, hope you enjoy it. This is the culmination of why I created this channel basically and what I was doing for the past year. So bye.
Picture this. You're in your third period English class. You're supposed to have read the first 3 chapters of The Great Gatsby, but you decided last night that it wouldn't be that important. However, your teacher is grading you on participation in the discussion this class, meaning you have to figure out the fastest way to gain a vague understanding of the text before you get called on. You turn to Spark Notes and give the bare minimum in the discussion, knowing that what you're saying is practically nonsense, but not having any way to change that. Welcome to the high school experience. But it doesn't have to be that way, and I wish it wasn't. So I decided to spend the last year finding reasons why it is and how people are moving to fix it. Being in high school often entails 2 things: having required readings and lamenting said required readings. Every few weeks you're bestowed another book, usually filled with the ramblings of some old man who lived decades ago, talking about a hypothetical that really applies to your current situation. Of course, what do you get out of it? An understanding of how to interpret literary works, as well as an arsenal of jokes you can make about how much you hated the book. Or you may not have understood the book at all, leading to a continual spiral about how you're never going to be able to keep up with all the assignments and tests being thrown at you. So what do? You turn to the internet. The internet universe of required reading is wondrous, harboring everything you need from written synopses to in-depth analysis to YouTube videos detailing the ins and outs of whatever book you're currently stressing about. With all of this in mind, I came up with my brilliant strategy for a senior passion project. I would join the fray of the thousands of YouTube channels in an effort to make my mark by helping people with their school readings however I could. Growing up with YouTube, I already had a lot of tools at my disposal. The expectations were set, and I was ready to go. My first few videos, of course, weren't the best quality, even with the quote-unquote experience that I had stated I had beforehand. Even looking at footage from my first video on East of Eden, you can see that maybe the heart was there, but the production value just wasn't. That's not to say you need a high-quality professional camera to start out, but maybe making sure your video quality doesn't look like it's been dunked in Vaseline would be a good start. In the beginning, I wasn't quite sure how to structure my videos. It felt like everything had been done before, from cartoon graphics to long drawn-out explanations. I wanted to create something different from what was already out there, otherwise I'd be drowned out of the algorithm from the start. So I started by giving my own high school student opinionated twist. I decided I would try to convince my readers to read the book I had chosen that week. My target audience wasn't people who were already reading or had planned to read the book that just needed a little extra help, but instead my fellow high school students that were refusing to read the book, either out of apprehension or stubbornness. With my own experiences, I gathered all the books I had read, or at least remembered reading, throughout my years, and compiled my own opinions and perspectives on them. After all, what people are most drawn to is the honest truth, and if they had never read the book before, what can be more honest than one of their peers who has? So, off I went on my journey to create a channel that would appeal to the masses, or at least the high school masses. In conjunction with these videos, I created a blog and an Instagram, both of which have been kind of left to the side. When I started out with them, though, I used them as a way to promote and add on to my videos. There are some things that are better said in the format of a written post that don't necessarily require a 10-minute long YouTube video. After researching what other students were being assigned across the nation, which was surprisingly uniform, I was able to create posts on summer reading, as well as more anecdotal stances on reading that I thought may draw in a wider audience. Students aren't the type to seek out information on something that's plaguing them as much as required reading does, so I had to work the system a bit. Using the knowledge I accumulated over my years of reading and watching others complain about school readings, I was able to compile articles on how to combat the urge to put the book down somewhere you never remember it and leave it to rot. While the tips themselves were not the most original, they created a foundation for my project that was a springboard into a more diverse territory of opinions. From there, I spread my literary wings, what a weird phrase, both on the website and in video form. I went from stilted videos outlining my favorite parts of an extremely long book to a more concise, flowing format. Shout out to East of Eden, which was not only the first video topic I thought of, but also the longest video, as I didn't quite know how to cut the fat, so to speak, and posted it at around 20 minutes. As a YouTube watcher as well as creator, I began noticing the smaller edits that other creators would make that made their videos more enjoyable to watch, that stopped you from feeling like you were dragging through the video. Over time, I learned how to implement these ideas to turn a 20-minute recording into a more reachable 10-minute video. Throughout this school year, I deliberately selected books every few weeks and fit them into my videos, carefully explaining why I thought said book was interesting based on my personal experiences with it. Though I knew not everybody would ultimately have the same opinions as me, I tried to keep it as personal to me as possible to convey an air of community on my channel. I wanted to make it clear that even though I was speaking on these topics to a large group of people, I was not an ultimate authority on anything besides my own opinion. My YouTube channel was a major part of beginning the process, but as I continued, I realized that it would take a while for it to grow, and I needed to create more focus on my idea that required reading needed to be changed in order for school-age kids to have less hate for literature. With this, I turned to more traditional methods of research, such as interviews. The activities I discussed in the past few minutes were only the tip of the iceberg. I realized this once I had reached a point in my plans that required a bit more involvement. When it came to creating a full-fledged project, I needed to incorporate another aspect of my journey that would bring different perspectives on the issue I had originally wanted to tackle: the issue of school-age kids finding their required readings boring. While my aim wasn't to solve the problem I was researching, I turned to professional interviews as my second course of action to discover direct perspectives on the topic from people who had experience in the subject at hand. My main goal with these professional interviews was to receive opinions and insight on the English curriculums in schools, students' interest in reading, and AR reading. Let's pause here for a second. What is AR reading? AR reading is essentially a program that has children answer questions related to the readings that they do inside or outside of school. Generally, it's only used for elementary school students, though there are extensions to middle school and the program is available for use in high school as well. The student's performance is measured by answering questions about the book, providing a point score at the end of each test, with each book having a different point value. On their own, the point values don't mean much, but teachers often assign values to them, for example, by tracking a class's total AR points and, depending on the value at the end of the semester, giving the students certain rewards. Back to the subject at hand. Let's take a look at the content of the interviews I conducted. First, we'll take a look at the answers of Dr. He taught high school English and math before he secured his position as assistant superintendent, so he is well versed in classroom dynamics. He believes that teachers do a good job of nurturing reading in students, saying that the curriculum is intended to expose students to a variety of fiction and nonfiction text, and is meant to cover different cultures, themes, and perspectives. These books provide a medium to meet the state standards of analysis and essay writing, including citing sources, supporting ideas with evidence found in those sources, and analyzing word choice. English language arts curriculum has 5 pillars: reading literature, reading informational text, writing, speaking and listening, and language. Additional standards are added for the AP courses, and there is a committee that helps decide on more books that they can add to the curriculum that are appropriate for certain grade levels and learning curriculum requirements. He believes that using AR reading is good and that using extrinsic motivations can be effective for some students, and it can expose students to new books by tempting them with high point rewards. However, it needs to be balanced with other aspects of literacy besides comprehension, because it may focus too heavily on one aspect of reading while neglecting the others. Secondly, is of the majority opinion that student interest in reading has decreased due to there being other options to distract them from reading, such as the internet. When required reading was first introduced, books were still a large medium that people were familiar with, but as times have changed, people are becoming more used to the screen than the page. He also states that literature-based classes are important no matter what students are planning to do in the future. With the opinion of a higher up in the school system in mind, let's take a look at the answers of who's focused on AP English, though she also teaches English 5/6, journalism, and creative writing. Believes that teachers often end up reading too many books with their class, so they don't spend enough time actually diving deep into the readings. This could be a factor of why students often resent their English curriculum, because they feel like they're falling behind as the teacher moves faster and faster through the books. She also believes that the length of the required readings is a factor in why students aren't as engaged these days. Social media is a form of reading as well, but in more easily digestible chunks, so when it comes to actually reading, traditional books may be too much to keep their attention. She found that effective ways to get students to retain information are to teach them annotations and summarizing techniques. In terms of curriculum, Beth is grateful that as an AP teacher she has flexibility, but there is often parent pushback from certain coverage of topics that are more sensitive or controversial, which can get in the way of teaching accurately. However, AP literature is important for any form of study, so sometimes these topics have to be broached. It's not all sunshine and roses. And finally, as our last subject for questions, I interviewed a Fulbright scholar and teacher that has, for about 15 years, rotated between many different classes, but has worked in literature and humanities, and recently taught at City School, a New York alternative high school, which have a very different approach to literature than the average public school. There is no required reading, but instead each teacher decides the reading curriculum based on their class. There are also no formal tests, but instead only project-based studies, and grades are more credit than actual grades. She feels that having required reading is not sensible in the society we live in today. Though having common literacy and writing skills is important, as well as critical thinking, there are a plethora of books that can be used to instill these ideas in students. Believes a common reason for depleted motivation in students could be the fact that they are constantly forced to relate to books that they cannot see themselves in, and don't get the chance to choose their own fate when it comes to reading. Not only that, but she does not like the idea of the AR reading program and thinks that commentary is more important for development, as closed book testing doesn't teach much over time. In addition, she states that yes, literature teachings can be helpful even for people who aren't into literature, as it teaches them thinking and analysis. It can also lead to people discovering their love for reading over time. However, AP classes can be rigorous and painful for people who only want to take it for the honor of being in an AP class for college. When it comes to these educator interviews, I found that generally all of the staff that are involved in educational matters are aware of the issues that I've been trying to cover in this project. With this, I am grateful that these education professionals were willing to provide their perspectives. Though it's hard to create monumental change on a classroom level, teachers are trying to lessen the blows to creativity that we've seen in the past, and there are administrators trying to fix issues within the curriculum to fit more modern times. Despite these efforts, it may be a long time before there is national change. Not every teacher, administrator, or politician is on the same page, and there will always be somebody trying to go against the system. With the insights from these interviews, though, we can see that even if they know that the current system isn't encouraging students, there are ways that they have learned to combat these effects by changing the way they teach or switching up their rewards method that may lead to a better academic future. So we've come to the last step in our journey. After all of this time, research, and outreach, what is the missing piece? The students, obviously. In my final task of data gathering for this project, I compiled a series of questions that were centered on the adolescent high school English class experience. It was then approved and sent out to the entire population of Shadow Mountain High School. I received about 200 responses, with a pretty even spread of opinions from every grade. The questions given on the survey were, when you're assigned a book for school, how much of the reading do you typically do? All of it, most of it, only a chapter or two, or none / I just read the online summaries for it. Do you objectively enjoy reading, for leisure or otherwise, yes or no, for which they were then asked to describe their answer in a following box. The star of the show was an all-encompassing question regarding the survey taker's opinion on required reading. I gave lots of options on both sides of the opinion spectrum so that the survey did not appear biased, and I provided an other slot that plenty of students took advantage of. You can see on the screen the range of answers I provided for the question from I have a love for reading to required reading is a chore. Walking around the average high school, you'll probably hear multiple kids complaining about the reading assignments they had last night. After all, complaining is in the blood of all teenagers across the world. But what may surprise you is that, in answering this survey, around a third of the takers reported that they do in fact read all of the book that is assigned to them. Of course, we must take into account sample size as well as volunteer bias that might lead to this number being higher than expected, as students who like reading may feel more inclined to take this survey, leading to a skewed proportion. I'm no statistician, but I'm taking AP statistics, so I do know a thing or two about fair surveys. But if we put that aside for a second to examine this data at face value for the purpose of this project, it's clear that there's a pretty even spread across the board of how students approach their required reading. The most common options are all or most of the book they're given, though students are definitely no stranger to reading little to none of the book and relying on websites like SparkNotes to get through. These kinds of websites were created for the demographic that I interviewed in this case, though, so you can't be surprised when they use it. However, it's still important to see that they're using these sites to measure the amount of motivation they likely have towards the subject. The usage of a site like SparkNotes, not sponsored, could be related to time constraints, reluctance to read, or the fear of being unable to understand the contents of the book if they were actually able to read it. While I did not ask for an explanation for this question, based on experience, I'd expect that time and desire to read would be the main factors reported. When I asked whether or not the survey takers objectively enjoyed reading, I found that surprisingly more than half the students who responded said yes. In this case, objectively enjoying reading is meant to mean that even with the existence of required reading, do they still enjoy picking a non-scholastic book up every so often and reading it? Though the survey was anonymous, so I cannot attribute names to any of the answers I quote here, there are a few trends and answers that I received that I would like to point out. There were relatively standard responses for why they may or may not like reading, but a common thread among all of the responses was that they were generally positive towards reading, but that school-required reading was not included in that equation. Like, I enjoy reading on my own time, and I like reading things that interest me, or even, I genuinely love reading when not pressured, give the impression that if we were to take these answers as a representation of all Shadow Mountain students, over half of the population would have something good to say about reading as a whole, but not about required reading. Some answers are more neutral, but give the same impression that time and experience have worn down their liking of the reading experience. I'm too busy to read, or I do enjoy reading, but because of my past experiences with reading, it has kind of ruined it for me. I'll point to the idea that some of the survey takers would like reading if it weren't for the connotations it's gained for them earlier in their education. On the negative responses, the answers are predictable as well. I don't like to read because it is boring and it takes a long time is an answer that I received that encompasses basically all of the answers from people who said they don't objectively enjoy reading. Of course, I won't be faulting them for that or judging them, but with this, we can look more at how the perception of reading has been distorted over the years to make it so that students don't enjoy any kind of reading, whether it be through comic books or 1,000-page novels. There must be more consideration in how schools approach reading in their classes, rather than just rolling through every book without regard to how it might affect the students. This leads into the big question that I mentioned earlier, in which I asked for the survey takers to check off as many of the below statements that they related to. The statement with the highest percentage of response was that required reading feels like a chore. Unsurprising, but a good fact to confirm. Whether or not a person enjoys a book, it can be daunting to be required to finish it. The next most agreed upon statement is we should read more relevant books, which is a broad topic on its own, but I also agree that it is an accurate statement. As discussed in the interview section previously, often required reading books are seen as outdated, and that's the primary reason why students don't feel motivated to read them. It seems that districts are working on updating the curriculum, but by the time it is updated, it may rapidly get out of date again. The answer with the lowest number of agreement is, I believe that literature will have a role in my life in the future. Again, not very surprising in that humanities, especially when it comes to literature, is not coveted by the average high schooler. However, students may be surprised to see that their literature interpretation knowledge could come in handy in the future through scientific texts and analysis of different projects that they may have to do in their working lives. Some answers that were given in the other category of this question were, it's harder to enjoy reading when you're being forced to read and analyze than when you simply read a book you're interested in, and reading is actually my favorite part of any English course, I just hate the analyzing that comes with it because that sucks all the enjoyment out of it. These answers only add to the argument that the forced curriculum is often the worst part of the required reading experience, where it forces the readers to be overly critical in situations where they feel like it might not fit. Though analysis is important, as mentioned before, it's important that there is consideration given to where the focus should be turned. In my final additional comment section, I gathered quite a few responses. While some were definitely on the interesting side, I got quite a few that voiced people's opinions on the subject of the survey as I asked for. While I don't have time to go over every single response, I want to mention a few of the answers given. One points out how each book is different in terms of class reception. While for one book the class may enjoy actually reading the book, another one might just not have that same pull. Peer pressure may have a major influence in these ideas, as when people do not see those around them reading class books, they probably think they don't have to do it, and it leads to a majority of the class not doing the reading. Others point out how it's better to do reading in class rather than out of class, as it feels more interactive, something that can be difficult for teachers to do in practice, but perhaps could be considered. Another answer looks at literature classes from a writing perspective, saying that writing an essay is not equivalent to actually writing a story based on language knowledge. This is another considerable issue, as a lot of the time schools will stop teaching grammar by the time middle school ends. This is dangerous, as many people end up going into high school and not being able to write proper essays because of a lack of grammar. Of course, these are just a few of the many answers that I received in this section, but we do not have the time to go over every single one. So, with all of this information presented to you, you may be wondering, Perry, what are you going to do with all of this? What is your goal? And to that I say, But in all seriousness, everything I've done over the past year has led me to believe one thing about required reading. It's not that effective. Whether the creators of the curriculum intend it to be or not, it's just not actively enriching student minds in schools, unless the person is extremely driven by internal motivation. Obviously, changes are being made as we speak, but when will they come? By the time that new changes are implemented, students may still be unsatisfied as goalposts shift and intellectual climates change. It will only be a matter of time, I feel, that we may have to do away with standardized required reading as a whole, and only assign books on a case-by-case basis. After all, wouldn't it be better for students not only to get to pick the books that they're going to read, but also know that they're going to enjoy and relate to them? Of course it would. It would get rid of both the problem of boredom and the problem of hating the books themselves due to content or unrelatability, and would probably increase the interest in reading generally. Physical books may be on the way out in today's society, but that doesn't mean we should stop reading relevant material altogether. It simply means that maybe we should take a different approach to it and start looking at the students' wishes instead of relying on politics or outdated beliefs. Required reading is not perfect and never has been, but it's essential that we do research like this to figure out what exactly the public opinion is. Only then will we be able to improve the system of reading and get kids back to liking books again. Unless you think you'd still hate them. I can't help with that.